Yeah, I'm back. Last video for today, end of the chapter. We left off, Gregor is woken up as a bug, but the main drama of the whole first chapter of the story is not, what the hell, I'm a bug now? It's, holy shit, I'm gonna be late for work. And wouldn't you know it, his parents are freaking out about that too. Pretty soon the manager shows up at the damn apartment yelling at him, and that's where we left off, is that Gregor's like desperately trying to open the door with his little bug legs now, and his boss is lecturing him about how he's not been performing well at work even before this, and Gregor is shooting back about how he's just not feeling well and he'll be there in a second or whatever. And finally Gregor gets the door opened and things go from bad to worse, because now everyone realizes that he's a giant vermin. Okay, so I'm gonna pick up reading on page 14. But at Gregor's first words, the manager, where am I? There we are, okay. Sorry, I'm on page 13. Sorry, I was off by a page there in my word. Excuse me. Sorry for the lack of editing in these videos. At this point, I'm in the middle of 13. Gregor's finally getting the door open. He's trying to come out there and be like, look, boss, I'll be there in a second. Like, just no dignity, no humanity. Even before he was a bug, he was being treated like something inhuman, subhuman by his boss. At this point, Gregor did not take one step into the room. He's got the door open now, but leaned his body from the inside against the firmly bolted wing of the door, so that only half his body was visible, as well as his head tilted sideways. So he's kind of like leaning around the door as a bug. Really cute. Visible, as well as his head tilted sideways, with which he peeped over at the others. Meanwhile, it had become much brighter. Standing out clearly from the other side of the street was a part of the endless gray-black house situated opposite. It was a hospital, with its severe regular windows breaking up the facade. The rain was still coming down, but only in large individual drops, visibly and firmly thrown down, one by one, onto the ground. The breakfast dishes were standing piled in the corner. He's getting to finally see what it's like outside of his room and in the rest of his house. The breakfast dishes were standing piled on the table, because of his father's breakfast was the most important meal of the day, which he prolonged for hours by reading various newspapers. Directly across on the opposite wall hung a photograph of Gregor from the time of his military service. It was a picture of him as a lieutenant, as he smiling and worry-free with his hand on his sword, demanded respect for his bearing uniform. The door to the hall was ajar, and since the door to the apartment was also open, one could see out into the landing of the apartment and the start of the staircase going down. And you can just sort of see his life as it used to be, and the little things that would go on. And then he tries to talk, but he can't be heard. And you see that contrast too, with this picture of him on the wall when he was so masculine and young and spry as a soldier. Now, said Gregor, well aware that he was the only one who had kept his composure, I'll get dressed right away, pack up the collection of samples, and set off. It's a bug. It's insane. He's totally doesn't. It's like he's the coyote in the Roadrunner things, where he's run off the cliff, but he hasn't looked down yet, so he hasn't fallen. Okay, but he's about to fall, or start to fall. I'll get dressed right away. You'll allow me to set up on my way, will you not? You see, Mr. Manager, I am not pig-headed, and I'm happy to work. Traveling is exhausting, but I couldn't live without it. Where are you going, Mr. Manager? To the office? Really? He's like running away because Gregor's terrifying looking. He's like he turned into a monster, and literally, and they don't know what to make of it. Okay, where are you going? Will you report everything truthfully? A person can be incapable of work momentarily, but that's precisely the best time to remember the earlier achievements and to consider that later, after the obstacles have been shoved aside, the person will work all the more eagerly and intensely. I am really so indebted to Mr. Chief. You know that perfectly well. On the other hand, I am concerned about my parents and my sister. I'm in a fix, but I'll work myself out again. Don't make things more difficult for me than they already are. Speak up on my behalf in the office. People don't like traveling salesmen. I know that. People think they earn pots of money and thus lead a fine life. People don't even have any special reason to think through this judgment more clearly. But you, Mr. Manager, you have a better perspective on what's involved than other people. Even, I tell you in total confidence, a better perspective than Mr. Chairman himself, who in his capacity as employer may let his judgment make casual mistakes at the expense of an employee. You also know well enough that the traveling salesman who is outside the office almost an entire year can become so easily a victim of gossip, coincidences, and groundless complaints, against which it's impossible for him to defend himself. Since for those, he just starts to argue, and then it's all so reasonable, but the circumstance renders it meaningless and ridiculous. So let's read on to the end. So then he's leaving the room, right? Like, manager, don't go, come back, don't fire me, I need this job. And you'll see what happens. Really, the metamorphosis is both of theirs. It's both. Gregor has one, but then his family too. Now that he can't work, they all have to go out and get jobs. His mom, his dad, sister. His dad gets a job as a kind of working class security guard, but he gets a uniform. He loses weight. He's kind of spry. They all kind of are revived to life with Gregor there dying as a bug. It's a brutal series of events from the perspective of Gregor. For other people, it's happy, but if your hero is Gregor, he's quite the hero, quite the fallen figure. Let's look at the very end of this, the last two paragraphs of the chapter. Across the room from him, his mother had pulled open a window. He's in the room now, and his parents are there, and they're terrified of him, and their main goal is just force him back into his bedroom and out of the salon, out of the dining room, parlor room. In spite of the cold weather and leaning out with her hands on her cheeks, she puts her face far outside the window. She's afraid. She wants to get away. Between the alley and the stairwell, a strong draft came up. The curtains of the window flew around. The newspapers on the table swished, and the window flew around. And individual sheets fluttered down over the floor. The father relentlessly pressed forward, pushing out sibilants that is just kind of saying, like not saying words, like a wild man. Now Gregor had no practice at all going backwards. It was really very slow going. If Gregor only had been allowed to turn around, he would have been in his room right away. But he was afraid to make his father impatient by time-consuming process of turning around, and each moment he faced the threat of a mortal blow on his back or his head from the cane in his father's hand. His father is going to hurt him, and he's going back too slow, and if he tries to turn around, his father might misinterpret it as an act of aggression. And again, you have to think of this as this almost like a extreme version of teenage, adolescent alienation anxiety that Kafka really never got over. Finally, Gregor had no other option, for he noticed with horror that he had not understand yet how to maintain his direction going backwards, and so he began, amid constantly anxious sideways glances in his father's direction, to turn himself around as quickly as possible, although in truth this was only done very slowly. Perhaps his father noticed his good intentions, for he did not disrupt Gregor in this motion, but with the tip of his cane from a distance, he even directed Gregor's rotating here and there like a dad. He's like, move, go over there a little bit, kind of coaching him or whatever. It's so ridiculous. If only his father had not hissed so unbearably. His dad's like, because of that, Gregor suddenly lost his head. He had already almost totally turned around when, always with this hissing in his ear, he just made a mistake and turned himself back a little. But when he finally was successful in getting his head in front of the open window, it became clear that his body was too wide to go through any further Naturally, his father, in his present mental state, so he's stuck in the door, like he's too wide to go in. Naturally, his father, in his present mental state, had no idea of opening the other wing of the door to create a suitable passage for Gregor to get through. His single fixed thought was that Gregor must get into his room as quickly as possible. He would never have allowed the elaborate preparations that Gregor required to orient himself and thus perhaps to get through the door. On the contrary, as if there were no obstacle, and with a peculiar nose, he now drove Gregor forwards. He's pushing him with this cane and like hurting him, trying to put him back in the room. Behind Gregor, the sound at this point was no longer like that, like the voice of only a single father. It's like this, man, who's the monster now, right? Now it was really no longer a joke, and Gregor forced himself, come what may, into the door. One side of his body was lifted up. He lay at an angle in the door opening, but his flank was sore from the scraping. On the white door, ugly blotches were left. Soon he was stuck fast and would not have been able to move any more on his own. The tiny legs on one side hung, twitching in the air above, and the ones on the other side were pushed painfully into the floor. Then his father gave him one really strong, liberating, not really, more like in prison, push from the behind, and he scurried, bleeding severely, far into the interior of his room. The door was slammed shut with a cane, and finally it was quiet. So his dad just, get out of here. And that's really a pattern you'll see repeated. In the next couple parts of the story, you'll see him, again, leaving the room for different reasons, not because he's trying to get to work, but for other reasons. And then his family, especially his father, forcing him back in the room. And it gets darker, but it also gets lighter in that Gregor becomes more, his reasons for doing it, for wanting to leave, become more about himself and what he wants, and less about what he feels like his obligations and expectations to everyone else are. So this is a journey of liberation, but it's done by Kafka, so it's an absurd one, full of menace, full of a kind of strange familiarity, but also a deeply unfamiliar reality as well. So I hope you're enjoying the story. Please try to read it as much as possible this week, and I'll be back at you on Wednesday talking about parts 2 and 3 of this wonderful story. Stay safe out there in the crisis, and power to the people.